the case for Zinzino in terms of it having relevance in a market, not just the business opportunity. The second goal is the two partners, and that comes as a side effect of that recruitment activity. So the point he's driving at is that Zinzino's business is underpinned by customers and a brand. And the branding of Zinzino itself is the bit that's going to, it's synonymous with testing and balanced oil and the idea of testing moving forward. And to a large extent, it's secondary in terms of its business opportunity for the vast majority of people. So the point about the US is, when you link it back into, the scale of the network marketing industry in the US, it's absolutely enormous. And it's only going to go on getting bigger, because opportunity, and especially when you get to Gen Z, Generation Z individuals, they don't want to work for a living. They want lots of jobs that provide them with an income. They want flexibility in their lives. They're not interested in having a job for life. They just don't think that way. When I was a kid, it was get a good job. It's get a good job. Well,
get your gold watch at the end of 40 years.
Yeah. And then there's, exactly.
You never lasted that long.
No, well, I didn't, and then the landscape started to change because redundancy started to begin to happen. I got made redundant in my mid 20s, having got a good job, really good job. And all of a sudden I found there was no loyalty in any way whatsoever from a company's point of view. And that's continued. And the trend in psychology in that respect has continued, because loyalty is not embedded in the way that companies focus upon employment. Just isn't. It's driven by HR metrics. That's another debate for another day. So people's desire for flexibility is getting a lot greater. But when you look at how Zinzino is structured, it's always about the product first. So one of the primary goals, the primary goal for me and for all of you, should be 25 customer subscriptions, regardless of how many partners you get. And all of you will hear me talk about scale in terms of outreach. If you're not outreaching enough, then you aren't going to have enough scale to create those subscriptions. And that in and of itself, I guess, is the daily activity. Anyway, I wanted to share that particularly with you because it talks about the big picture of the future. And it also reminds us how little we've done. Not us, but collectively as a business, how little Zinzino has done, considering how big we think it is. Actually, how big it is pretty tiny when it's only done 48,000 tests across the whole of the US and Canada. I don't know what we've done here. How many have we done here now? 25, 26?
Well, I think Steve said it was 22,000.
Well, you can check easily enough. It's on zinzinotest.com.
Yeah.
So it's easy to find out. So we've done nothing either. Our market's tiny, relatively.
In comparison, to...
so we 10x that, that's 200,000 tests. And that's not 1.5% of our population. What's the UK population? About 68 million, something like that. So 689. So it's just over a million. That would be just over a million. 1.5%. It's a lot. Think how big your business will be. Anyway, so I wanted to. Has anybody got any comment they want to make about what I've shared there? And who's got connections in America? Hands up. Right. Yes, kind of, sort of. Not most of us have some, but not many. But I wasn't using it that way. It was more important to get the really big picture. So Sue, anything you want to add? Oh, Sue, you've frozen. How have you managed that? Oh, now you've gone. I'm host. Well, in that case, we'll move on. Where Sue comes back. In fact, that's a little bit awkward because now I have to control Zoom again. And I don't need DAG anymore, but I do need this. Bear with me a second.
Sorry, I got kicked out.
Yes, you did. I was just about to start sharing the 21 irrefutable laws of leadership.
Well, I can do that now. Well, have it standing by on your system just in case I get kicked out again. It's we've had a neighbour move in next door, and we're sharing.
Are we? Is he
Well,
sharing?
I don't know whether we're sharing or not.
I hope not.
No.
I can find out easily enough. I'll check the router later.
Yeah, but anyway, bear with me 1 second. Let me go to. You see my screen? Okay.
Yeah, I can see your screen.
17, the law of priorities. The law of priorities says that leaders understand that activity is not necessarily accomplishment. So let's talk about that for a moment. Activity is not necessarily accomplishment. Some of these laws I do better on than others, and there are some laws that I excel more than others. I want to just say that probably of the 21 laws, this is my best law. I really do understand the law of priorities. And so let me give you a little bit of background. I'm working on a business degree in Indiana back in 1971, 72 in college. And I read in a textbook about the Pareto principle. A guy named Alfredo Pareto. It was the first time that I ever was introduced to what is known sometimes as the 80-20 principle. The first time that I've ever was introduced to it, and basically Pareto taught in that one paragraph in that book about priorities. And I remember reading that paragraph and saying to myself, this is very important to me. I need to learn priorities the way Pareto taught them. And so I became a student of Pareto. I became a student of priorities. And that was, my goodness, that was well over 30 years ago. And I can tell you that when people look at what little things that I've been able to accomplish, and they come and say, how can you accomplish so much? I can always tell them with great integrity, this law right here, the law of priorities, I have worked on and I have excelled in. So let's look at your notes, because this is a terrific law to teach. I've already got a diagram for you. So let's just look at the diagram for a second. On the left-hand column is priorities. And by the way, since I'm doing some teaching on this, I want you to put a slice there, and I want you to put the word people. Because I'm going to teach you priorities, but I'm also going to teach you how to prioritize your people in about 5 minutes. So, but for now, the left-hand column is priorities, and the right-hand column is production, and it pretty well explains itself. Here's what Pareto says. Pareto says that if you have 10 things to do, and you prioritize those 10 things correctly, if you only do 2 of them, but you do the top 2, you're going to get an 80% return on everything you need in your life. It's very obvious. You do 2 things, you go to the production side, 80% return. That's huge. Pareto goes on and says, let's say instead of doing the top 2 things, you do the bottom 8. You ignore the top 2. The most important things you ignore, and you do the bottom 8. Here's what Pareto says. If you do the bottom 8, if you go to the production side, you can see you're only going to have a 20% return. That's why it's sometimes called the 80-20 principle or the 20-80 principle. It's really talking about how to prioritize your life. And Pareto says, if you prioritize your life correctly, if you do just the 2 things out of 10 that you need to do, the most important 2, 80% of everything you want in your business. I can tell you this works in your family. If you prioritize your family time right, 80% of everything you need in your family, it's going to happen if you understand how to work the top 20%. What I have found is most people don't understand the 20-80 principle, and so therefore they don't put the time, energy, and effort in the top 20%, so therefore they don't get the return. Now, this is a great principle, but there are 3 questions, priority questions, that you need to ask yourself, that I need to ask myself, that helps me to establish this top 20%. Question number 1, requirement. I've got to ask myself, what is required of me? In other words, I've got to look at my job. I've got to look at my company, my organization, the one that I work for. There are certain job descriptions. There are certain requirements of the job. And I got to basically say, okay, what do I have to do? Because whatever I have to do, I have to do it. If I don't do those, I'm fired. So it's got to be a priority. True? So I got to ask what's required of me. The second word is return. I've got to look at all the things I do, and I have to ask myself this question: what gives me the greatest return? The third word is reward. I have to ask myself the question, what gives me the greatest reward? Now, those three questions I have found to be huge in understanding the 20/80 principle. But Alfredo Pareto says that if you prioritize your life correctly and you do the top 20%, you get an 80% return. And on that top 20%, I have to have those three R's. What's required of me? What gives me the highest return? What gives me the greatest reward? See, I've got to ask the requirement question, because if I don't do that, well, then I'm out of a job. I've got to ask the return job question, because if I don't do that well, I'm not going to produce. And I've got to ask the reward job, because if I don't like what I'm doing and I continually do it, it's only a matter of time till I quit. Requirement, return, reward. Let me illustrate it. I only have 4 things that I have to do. In fact, when I tell people that I only have 4 priorities, they look at me, they just kind of look at me and say, what do you mean you only do 4 things? What I mean is I only do 4 things. They say, well, no, I mean, don't you do other things? No, read my lips. Now, the reason I only do 4 things is a lot of reasons. One is I understand priorities. Number 2 is I'm kind of worthless in most things in life. It's just a gift, so it's not yours, so don't worry about it. Okay. But worthless I am. But the 4 things I do very well. And my whole team understands this. And they do everything around me so that I can stay focused on these 4 areas, because these 4 areas bring a huge return to me and to my companies that I have. So let me give you the 4 things. I'm only giving you these 4, not because these are going to be your 4, because they're not going to be. But you're going to have to go through the process, which literally took me months to go through, until you can settle in what your strengths are, what you need to be spending your time with. My 4 priorities, very simple. Number 1 is leadership. I lead well, so I spend a lot of time leading. It's a gift, and I know it. Number 2 is communication. I do it almost every day. I speak places. I lecture. I teach. I do a lot of communication. Why? Because it's a strength. The third is create or /write. I spend a lot of time creative thinking. I spend a lot of time in writing. Again, why? Because it's a strength of mine. I love to write books so that I can add value to people that I'll probably never meet. And the 4th area is in networking or relationships. Now, those are the 4 things I do. I either lead, communicate, create, or relate with other people. Those are the 4 things. I don't do anything else. You say, John, why don't you do anything else? Because I'm not any good at anything else. You've got to play to your strengths, not to your weaknesses. It's very important for you to understand. Listen to me carefully. People don't pay for average. They haven't paid for average in your life. They're not going to pay for average in my life. People don't pay for average. So quit trying to be average. Find out what you do well. Stay to your strengths, because that's the ace. That's what's going to bring you home. Now, these 4 areas, these are the 4 areas I stay in. I don't do anything else. Now, I have to have a lot of things done, so I have players around me that they complete me, and they do things for me that are huge on the team, that are vitally important. Now, I'm not saying these are the only 4 important things. I'm just saying, for me, these are the 4 things that I do, and these are my 4 top priorities. These give me the greatest return. These give me the greatest reward. You see, what Pareto is teaching you and me are the following lessons. He's teaching us, first of all, it's not how hard you work, it's how smart you work. He's teaching us that it's not how much time you put in the job, it's how you prioritize the job to be effective in it. He's teaching us things such as organize or agonize. In other words, get your act together and get organized, or you're going to always be behind the 8 ball and you're going to be agonizing because you're trying to always catch up. He's saying things such as choose or lose. Either you choose your priorities or you'll lose your priorities to somebody else that will choose them for you. The question is not will your calendar be full. The question is who will fill your calendar. He's saying things like evaluate or stalemate. Evaluate your priorities on a consistent basis, or if you don't, you're going to plateau, you're going to stalemate before long. Now, before I close this incredible law of priorities, let's go back to the diagram one more time. I want you to, instead of looking at priorities on the left-hand column, I want you to look at people. I wish I had 30 minutes to teach this part of the lesson. I'll try to do it in 30 seconds. If you have 10 people in your organization, or let's say you have 100 and each number represents 10, Here's what Pareto says. If you have 100 people in your organization, if you prioritize them according to effectiveness in your company, 20 of those 100 people would be giving you 80% return on everything you need in your organization. And the other 80 would be giving you a 20% return. And what Pareto would be saying to you and me as leaders is, you better prioritize your people. And what he would be saying is, once you prioritize them according to effectiveness, here's what Pareto would say is, he would say, spend 80% of your time with the top 20% of your people, because that's where the return is. Let me tell you what our biggest mistake is as leaders. I see it happening all the time. Instead of spending 80% of our time with our top 20%, do you know who we spend 80% of our time with?
20%.
The bottom 20%. Because they've got questions and they want help and they've got an alley and oh, it's tough. We say, well, the top 20%, they don't need my time. The bottom 20%, they need your time. Listen, you got to decide whether you're going to be a counselor or an equipper. If you're a counselor, you're going to work with the bottom 20%. If you're an equipper, you're going to work with the top 20%. If you're a counselor, you're going to work on the weaknesses of people. If you're an equipper, you're going to work on the strengths of people. And I'll discuss that in another law coming up. Well, the law of priorities is absolutely huge. Basically, Pareto says, get your act together. Prioritize your life, prioritize your people, prioritize your time, and give 80% of the time to the top 20%, you'll get a huge return.
Right, are we going straight into the next one, Nigel?
Law number 18 is the law of sacrifice.
No.
Oh, hang
and
on.
The law of sacrifice says,
hang on.
I'll leave.
Okay, we're not going straight into that.
No, I just want to pick up on the on recognizing your strengths. And we'll do a session on the traits of network marketers. In fact, we'll do that next week, because actually I think this law 17 in particular is really important, because it points the way to understanding your own strengths and weaknesses. And so we'll go through a session on first of all, identifying what the traits of a network marketer need to be, because being successful in this business is it's multifaceted as is anything at the end of the day. But when you're outside of a work environment where the organizational structure takes over the demands of the job, your day in effect, in terms of how you structure what you do, and the output and the outcome of what you do is driven by the organizational goals largely. So you fit within those. We know what the organizational goals, but the difference with networking is that we all have our personal goals, which we talk about a lot, because if you don't have a strong why, you don't do the work that's necessary to create a successful business. Now that can in and of itself lead to a lot of frustration, because if you don't know why you're doing something or why you're doing it, what's motivating you to do it, you don't overcome the issues. But more importantly, if you don't understand what you need to do and what you have to have in terms of skills, then it makes it much more difficult to become successful at all effectively. So I think we'll cover that in much more detail next week. I've got a presentation about that, but I haven't got enough time to cover it right now. So we'll whiz through the next one, but I'm going to cover 17 in particular next time round. So, Sue?
Yeah. Bear with me. Bear with.
In fact, I can remember several years ago now doing a leadership lesson entitled, You Have to Give Up to Go Up. And into that lesson, I can remember my outline, because it was very simple. I said, first of all, and it was about getting up the top. And I said, first of all, you have to get up to go up. Because I know all kind of people, they're still in bed. You know what I mean? They're still in bed. They haven't realized, you probably ought to get out of bed before you can be successful. You got to get up to go up. That's step number one. Get out of bed. Enter in the arena of action. Take some initiative. Do something. Okay, you got to get up to go up. And after you get up to go up, after you do that, secondly, you got to grow up to go up. You got to grow up. I know people who have never matured. They're still talking about the same thing, doing the same thing. They've never developed like this. So if you want to get to the top, you don't have to get up to go up. You got to grow up to go up. And then in the tape, I remember I talked thirdly in the leadership lesson about, well, you got to give up to go up. And that's what we're going to talk about in just a moment. And then the last thing I said is you need to gather up to grow up. You need to get your team together. If you really want to go to the top, you've got to gather up people, because as I teach in the laws of teamwork, law number 4, the law of Mount Everest says, as the challenge escalates, the need for teamwork elevates. In other words, you've got to get a team around you, and you've got to get that team helping you to get to the top. So let's talk about the law of sacrifice. A few years ago, there was a tragedy at Mount Everest where a couple of guides got into a storm with a few of their people, and there were a few deaths. And I can remember a 60-minute interview that I watched. It's a very interesting interview because they were talking to one of the guides who, of course, lived, and they were talking about the tragedy. I think it was Mike Wallace, if I'm not mistaken, in that interview, and he asked a couple of questions that especially arrested my attention. One of the questions he asked was, why do you risk your life to take people to the top? And I remember the guide said, well, it's because that's my job. My job is to take people to the top. That's why they call me a guide. And Mike Wallace says, well, couldn't you get to the top by yourself without harm or injury? And oh yes, I could do that. But it's my job to take people to the top. And the guide kept coming back to Mike Wallace and said, it's my responsibility. That's who I am. I'm a guide. And when I listened, I thought, how true to a leader that is. It's our job as leaders to take people to the top. Mike Wallace continued that interview, and then he looked at me and said, I don't think it's worth the risk. I mean, after all, to risk your life or have people in your party that not make it. He said, I don't think it's worth the risk. And then he looked at the guy and said, why do you risk your life to get to the top of the mountain? And I'll never forget, that guide looked at him, and when Mike Wallace asked that question, the guide is looking into his face like, I can't believe you asked me that question. Why do I risk my life to get to the top? He looked at Mike Wallace and said, it's obvious to me that you've never been to the top of Mount Everest. It's obvious to me. You've never been to the top of the mountain. It's obvious that you've never been there. If you would have ever been to the top, you would never ask that question. When I think of that interview, I think of leaders. Once we have been to the top and see how glorious it is, what do we want to do? We want to go back down, and we want to find some other people and say, I want you to take a trip with me. I want to show you things you have never seen. I'm going to give you experiences that you have never experienced. That's what leaders do. Leaders have been to the top, and they want to take as many people with them to the top as they possibly can. Now, here's what I want you to understand. To get to the top, you've got to give up something. It was Emerson who said, for everything you gain, you must lose something. That's why I have in your workbook what I call the leadership pyramid. The leadership pyramid is a prime example of giving up to going up. Basically, the leadership pyramid says that when you enter an organization, I guess you got all kind of options left and right, but as you become a leader, and as you become a leader in that organization, the higher you go in this leadership pyramid, the less options you have. Now, I want to say that I teach this leadership pyramid all the time. I think that most leaders, and I think a lot of leaders in corporate America and in leadership organizations around the world, do not understand the leadership pyramid. For example, I run into leaders who all the time think that the higher they go, the more options they should have, the more perks they should have. I don't think so. I think the higher you go, the less options you have. I think that the greatest leaders are what I would call servant leaders. They're leaders who understand that they're a leader to make it better for the people. You're not a leader to make it better for yourself. Now, if you're a good leader, it will be better for you because you'll have the joy of taking people across the finish line. And there's no greater fulfillment and joy than that. So if you are a leader and you're taking people across the top, it's going to be very good. But what I want you to understand is this. You don't lead because of perks. In fact, what I found is this. Most leaders, they become leaders because they like the perks of leadership. But most people have not counted the price of leadership. What you're going to have to give up, what you're going to pay. My dad taught me when I was just a kid. He said, John, pay now, play later. That's the way it works. And he said, if you don't pay on the front end, you don't get a play on the back end. In fact, he said, oh my, I'll never forget this. He said, John, the longer you wait to pay the price, the higher it becomes. So learn quickly, pay on the front end. And I'm saying to each one of us today, as we're teaching this principle, the law of sacrifice, what we've got to do is we've got to understand that we have to pay on the front end. There's a price to pay to be a leader. It's not always easy. It's not always fun. In fact, when I teach leadership, one of the things I'm most concerned about is, why do you want to become a leader? Do you want to become a leader because you think there are a lot of perks in it for you? Or do you want to become a leader because you want to add value to people and take them to a higher level than they could ever go on their own? So let's go to the workbook. Because there are 3 sacrifice statements that I want to make. Number 1, there is no success without sacrifice. Let's just start there. You say, John, what do you mean? What I mean is, there is no success without sacrifice. There's not an escalator waiting to take you to the top. Quit standing outside waiting for the chairlift to take you to the top. Nobody ever got to the top of a mountain and at the end of the day said, oh my goodness, how did I get here? Instead of saying, I just took a stroll and the next thing I knew, I was on top of this mountain. No. You can fall off the top by accident, but you can't roll to the top by accident. If you get to the top, it's because you gave up something. And let me tell you something that all experienced mountain climbers will tell you. Before they take that big trip to the top, the main question they ask themselves is, what are the essentials I must take with me? Because they know anything except essentials will be a detriment to keeping them from what that goal is. So when they get ready to go to the top, they don't back up a U-Haul truck. Say, I'm going to throw this stuff in the truck. I may need it while I'm up there. No, they give up. They give up to go up. So there is no success without sacrifice. Number 2, the higher the level of leadership, the greater the sacrifice. That's a fact. The higher you go in your leadership, the more you'll give up. I remember thinking when I started off in my career, in my business to go to success, I remember thinking in the very beginning, boy, I was willing to do anything to get to the top. Of course it was. I didn't have to give up anything. Hey, when you have no money, it's not hard to give it up. When you have no position or reputation, it's not hard to give it up. You say, well, why was I so foolish as a youth? You weren't foolish as a youth. You didn't have anything. But as you grow higher, one of the reasons many leaders never get to the top is because as they go higher, they get more stuff. And they have to make these trade-off decisions that become very difficult for them. The third thing I want you to know about success is you have to give up to stay up. You not only have to give up to go up, once you get on top, you have to give it up. The reason most sports teams can do consecutive world championships is because after they win their first world championship, all the players go on the chicken banquet tour. They spend the next year getting fat, telling everybody how they did it last year. And you don't reproduce yourself by telling your story. You reproduce yourself. You stay on top by giving up continually. About 5 years ago, I did a lesson that really fits this whole law of sacrifice. It was entitled 10 Trade-Offs Worth Making. And I was at a very important part of my own career where I was 50 years old. And I was going to have to make some major changes, and I was going to have to give up some major wonderful perks and things I had in my life if I wanted to go to the next level. And I can remember that day as I sat down at my desk with my legal pad and I began to look at the trade-offs. Trade-offs such as I was willing to give up affirmation. People tell me what a good job I was doing for accomplishment to get to a next level. I was willing to give up financial gain for future potential. I was willing to give up immediate pleasure for personal growth. I was willing to give up the quantity of life for quality of life. I was willing to give up security for significance. I was willing to give up acceptance for excellence. I was willing to give up addition for multiplication. I began to work through all these things I was willing to give up. And I can remember making the conscious decision to keep on going. But I also remember, as I looked at that list, I realized that the higher you go, the price gets higher. That's why many people get about 2/3 of the way up and never climb any higher.
Right.
Thank you. On that note, I'll round up with this, and we'll go over this stuff a little bit more detail next week, because we're nearly at the top of the hour. Some years ago, there's a very big company called AT&T. Some of you may have heard of them. They're in the communications industry, and they wondered why people reached middle management and didn't go any further, when clearly these people had talent and ability, and they could do more. So they did some really genuine testing, psychological testing on them, in order to establish the reason for that, the kind of disconnect between their apparent level of ambition and where they were in the business, because they could go further. And what they learned was that what the research showed was that those people had simply not got ambition that was contiguous with those of the business. They weren't in tune, in other words, with the aspirations and goals of the organization, to the extent that would enable them, or make them want to give up the comfort they were in order to become more than that, perceptually. In other words, it was the perception of the business that was being put upon them, not the perception of the individual. So they were exercising a personal choice not to go further. Now that's unique for everybody. You know, where is the level? You set your own level, literally you do. But if you want more, you've got to do what Maxwell was talking about there, which is you have to pay the price to make it happen. And that's very often what we describe as the comfort zone, you know, because we might need to upskill. We might need to change our attitude about something. There are various things that need to be worked upon in order to get to the next level, whatever that is. And that's always a personal choice again. So so what this is really driving at is the personal evaluation of what it is you want to get, where you want to be, what you want to have. And the clarity of that picture makes the difference in terms of the level of achievement ultimately, because it points the way towards the things you've got to do in order to make that happen. And so that becomes driven by not just your level of thought, but your level of visualization for yourself in terms of seeing how your image as you move forward. We're bang on 11 o'clock.
We should really I was just going to say, we should really cover this coming up to the last week now. So we've got till next week to complete really the not the fast starts, the qualification for the ECB. And some of you, I've looked at some of your back offices and, kind of in my reporting, and you're halfway there. Some are a bit more. Some congratulations to those of you who've got there. No, Paul has reached there for sure. I know that Kelly's, kind of in process. Tom's in process. So lots of people are in process. Make sure you just achieve that. And, we're in the same situation. So we're halfway through as well. And we need a little bit more as well. So we've got to achieve that. If it comes to the last minute and you're short, then you do have the option to get the ECB pack, which is available in your back office. If you go to shop and then partner packs, it will be within that partner packs, and it will be the ECB pack, which I believe is £339. Forgive me if it's slightly out, 339, and that gives you some extra tests. So maybe you need extra tests so that you can share those with people to actually kind of gain those customers. That 200% ECB offers the option for you to have a massive September. And, the people who have sent us their goals for September, and those of you who came to Dave and Shan's leadership.
Oh, she's disappeared again. She's gone. I suspect she might drop out. Right. I won't over-egg the pudding. We'll have another call on Saturday next week. That's just before the end of the week. This last week is always the biggest one of the year, of the month anyway, from the point of view of Zinzino's revenues. So go out, make hay, get qualified. Let's work on a massive September. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all. See you next week.